My name is Michael Krasny. I have a PhD in literature from the University of Wisconsin and have been a professor of English at San Francisco State University since 1970. I also host a weekday news, public affairs, and culture and arts and science talk program on the National Public Radio affiliate, KQED Radio in San Francisco. It will be my pleasurable task to take you on, well, let's call it a conversation with great authors through a series of lectures on stories by some of the world's greatest writers, who will immerse you in their worlds and affect your minds and hearts as only great stories can. The value of studying stories like the ones we will be studying is in the simple fact that they transport our imaginations. They heighten our senses and consciousness and yield insight, knowledge, and, we hope, wisdom. What discipline, really other than fiction, combines nearly every other area of knowledge in its study and also provides a reality that many believe to be superior in its overall effects on what we normally believe reality to be? We read and interpret stories to enter into the exciting life of the mind and to see. As the poet Adrian Rich said, what we see, and seeing is changing. Let's have a brief look at the short story and its history, the arc of the stories we will be studying, and a consideration of how we interpret meaning and evaluate fiction. Edgar Allan Poe defined the short story generally as not being as long as a novel or novella, or what at one time later on would be called a novelette. In other words, short enough to read and absorb in a single sitting. Short stories can be anywhere up to around 15,000 words if you're word counting, but defining a short story is a little bit like, well, the idea of putting Jell-O on a tree. But a short story should grab you, should engage you, rivet you into what Gabriel Rossetti called a moment's monument. You read stories, usually one at a time, and if they are great or even good, they keep you reading right up until the end. J.D. Salinger, the famed author of The Catcher in the Rye, once said he was a dash man and not a long-distance runner, though he did write one short novel during his career before turning to collections of short stories. Short story writers run the dash, but novelists are the long-distance runners. Short fiction has a long pedigree, a history of the tale going back to oral narratives and oral storytelling, and oral history, but also located in myths and biblical stories, and the anecdotes of ancient Rome. They have their origins also in fables, folktales with moral exempla built in, like Aesop, who gave us such famous fables as The Tortoise and the Hare. Western and European stories and tales have their origins in poetic forms of the 14th century, such as Chaucer's Canterbury Tales and Boccaccio's Decameron. We'll see, in a number of the short fiction writers who we'll be discussing, works of short fiction that, like the Decameron and the Canterbury Tales, fit into larger works. There are stories that are read and taught as stories that are, in fact, part of the much broader canvas of a novel, but that can nevertheless stand alone as short stories. The modern short story bloomed in the 19th century with the market created by journals and magazines, often shocking or horror stories like the Grimm fairy tales or German tales of shock and horror. In the United States, these were the stories of Washington Irving, the most famous being the ones about the legendary Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow, and the tale of Rip Van Winkle, who falls asleep when King George is ruling the colonies and wakes up 20 years later to the visage of General George Washington. Short fiction appeared and flourished nearly simultaneously in the United States and Russia. It flourished later in France, where Poe was greatly admired, and later still in the British Empire, where big novels, often serialized, held sway. In Ireland and in German-speaking Europe, where medium-length novellas had been more the norm for short fiction. The trajectory of storytelling, as we look at the masters of 2 centuries, moves from simple, highly plotted tales to increasing realism, putting the mirror up to nature, and then to forms of experimentation and an increased opening up in fiction to the complexities of modern life, psychological, racial, ethnic, sexual, and identity-based. That is, there's a movement from realism to modernism, from realism with some elements of the allegorical or moral tale, the fabulous tale, based on myth and fable, and the surreal tales built from the unconscious mind, to more modernist stories, both steeped in realism or built on fabulism and parable, myth, self-reflexivity, autobiography, or history. Voices change as writers open up to younger voices, ethnicity, and gender, and what we see in the evolution of short fiction masterpieces is a changing canon. That's the established body of what is deemed to be great literature, and a changing marketplace that is increasingly cross-cultural, cosmopolitan, and global. The key to understanding stories is often vested in what we call intertextuality, stories building on other stories through the progression of time and many of them continuing to possess within them related themes and ideas and similar elements of expression, such as the use of allegory. We also see stories that draw us in by making us wonder what is coming next, to stories that have more to do with characters being revealed or revealing themselves, stories that leave things out, and stories that include pointed details and small observations, stories that are more like drama, as we'll see in the great storyteller Chekhov, who was also a dramatist, and stories that are, well, more like poetry, even up to and including so-called confessional poetry like that of Robert Lowell, Anne Sexton, or Sylvia Plath, American poets of the post-World War II era who explored personal terrain through the creation of characters who confess the secret content of their hidden inner lives. What we want is to discover what makes the stories we'll be discussing great, and why and how they yield richness of meaning, and, in addition to interpretation, how we evaluate their worth. This can sometimes be challenging, even vexing. But there are essentially four major ways of interpreting and evaluating short fiction, and each of the four is intimately connected to craft and to the tale's impact on readers. These are four good touchstones to assessing what a masterpiece is. First, there's the text, looking at the language in the story, its metaphors, symbolism, meanings that we can attribute to the author's choice of words. We'll read text between about 1,000 and 15,000 words. Secondly, the author, his or her personal history and psychology, influences and cultural background, all of which can and often do go beyond and outside the text. We're going to read 23 stories in depth by 6 authors born in the first half of the 19th century, and 6 born in the second half, and 11 born in the first half of the 20th century. English is where the development of short fiction has been most firmly planted, and we'll read writers from Canada to South Africa to New Zealand, as well as 10 or 11 stories by U.S. authors, and another 5 or 6 by authors from throughout the rest of the English-speaking world, depending on how you count Henry James, an American-born writer who was an expatriate in England. The remaining stories are by authors who were Russian, French, and Czech or German, depending on where you want to place Franz Kafka, and South American. Third, the reader. How does the story affect you as a reader? How the role of the reader has changed through the course of the history of short fiction we will also take into account. And as stories become more sophisticated and modern, the role of the reader becomes more collaborative. And finally, mimetic reality. That is, how does the story depict or otherwise represent, mime, what we distill as reality, with all the major changes brought in by world wars, and industrialization, and technology, and seismic shifts in mores. Selections of stories that we're going to discuss are based on historic and canonical considerations of great critical acclaim, and the inclusion of individual stories that have appeared in a wide range of anthologies and fiction volumes. The accepted taste of literary criticism and literary scholarship is a stock market, obviously in flux and up for debate. Somerset Maugham and Robert Louis Stevenson were once high on the stock exchange of short fiction writers, while William Faulkner and F. Scott Fitzgerald were not. Writers' reputations change and shift. But the greatness attributable to short fiction is directly tied to authorial genius and the effect and impact of the story on a wide range of readers, to the universality of the story's themes and ideas, its emotional and empathic and evocative power, its originality, and frankly, on this professor's scholarly and personal choices. Greatness is also inextricably linked to form and content, language, or what's called stylistics, and craft, and to the meaning that the individual story yields, how and to what degree it moves or stirs us, and how or to what extent it lasts or is likely to endure. When I was in graduate school, we used to have the notion that there would be a space capsule that would go into the future. What works would we want to include in that space capsule? As if we could decide somehow what would be the best works for ongoing generations. But what better place to begin a course on masterpieces of short fiction than with the earliest American master of suspense, Edgar Allan Poe, who has given us such classic stories as The Telltale Heart, The Fall of the House of Usher, and The Cask of Amontillado, which is the first story we will focus on. We begin with Poe in this course because of his emphasis on plot and unity, and a credible sounding, though quite possibly unreliable, narrator. And we move through stories of greater realism and more open plots. Sometimes no plots at all, as we venture also into some of the experimental fiction of the 20th century. Poe was also a seminal figure in the ushering in of detective stories, even years before those world-famous British detective Sherlock Holmes stories by Arthur Conan Doyle, who started writing detective fiction nearly a half-century after Poe. Poe was also an early contributor to science fiction stories with Malanta Tonta in 1840, and other work of his including The 1002nd Tale of Scheherazade. In short, Poe pioneered three distinct genres of short fiction. Today, Poe might be classified as a commercial writer, despite his lack of commercial success, a woeful lack, I might add, and there still exists a Rubicon in the mind of many literary critics between popular or pulp fiction for the masses and more literary or aesthetically imbued fiction for the higher brow reader. As we'll discover, these are often indistinct lines that can be grossly exaggerated. We begin with Poe also because Poe was a pathfinding theorist of the short story who grounds us in a theory of short fiction and its effects. He wrote an early disputation, one of the earliest on record, about the singular effect of the short story. The importance of the single effect in a prose tale was published in 1842, and in it, Poe used Nathaniel Hawthorne as an example of a storyteller who provides what only the short story can provide for a reader. Unlike the novel, with a story like the Cask of Amontillado, Poe's great tale of suspense and revenge, the effects on us as readers emerge from a single sitting. Only a handful of pages and Poe transports us to a world of masquerades and motley, a carnivalesque world of conical caps and bells, and then into an underground world of catacombs and skeletons, and into what appears to be a perfect crime, a grotesque and calculated premeditated murder. A live burial narrated by the murderer from the perch of a half-century later. The emphasis in this story is on plot, a compressed narrative that comes to us through the authentic and riveting voice of a murderer. The 1,000 injuries of Fortunato I had borne as best I could, but when he ventured upon insult, I vowed revenge. You, who so well know the nature of my soul, will not suppose, however, that I gave utterance to a threat. At length, I would be avenged. This was a point definitely settled, but the very definitiveness with which it was resolved precluded the idea of risk. I must not only punish, but punish with impunity. A wrong is unredressed when retribution overtakes its redresser. It is equally unredressed when the avenger fails to make himself felt as such to him who has done the wrong. It must be understood that neither by word nor deed had I given Fortunato cause to doubt my goodwill. I continued, as was my wont, to smile in his face, and he did not perceive that my smile now was at the thought of his immolation. He had a weak point, this Fortunato, although in other regards he was a man to be respected and even feared. He prided himself on his connoisseurship in wine. Few Italians have the true virtuoso spirit. For the most part, their enthusiasm is adopted to suit the time and opportunity, to practice imposture upon the British and Austrian millionaires. In painting and gemmery, Fortunato, like his countrymen, was a quack. But in the matter of old wines, he was sincere. In this respect, I did not differ from him materially. I was skillful in the Italian vintages myself, and bought largely whenever I could. It was about dusk, one evening during the supreme madness of the carnival season, that I encountered my friend. He accosted me with excessive warmth, for he had been drinking much. The man wore motley. He had on a tight-fitting party-striped dress, and his head was surmounted by the conical cap and bells. I was so pleased to see him that I thought I should never have done wringing his hand. I said to him, "My dear Fortunato, you are luckily met. How remarkably well you are looking today. But I have received a pipe of what passes for Amontillado, and I have my doubts." "How?" said he. "Amontillado? A pipe? Impossible! And in the middle of the carnival." "I have my doubts," I replied, "and I was silly enough to pay the full Amontillado price without consulting you in the matter. You were not to be found, and I was fearful of losing a bargain." "Amontillado?" "I have my doubts." "Amontillado! And I must satisfy them. Amontillado! As you are engaged, I am on my way to Lucchese. If anyone has a critical turn, it is he. He will tell me Lucchese cannot tell Amontillado from sherry. And yet some fools will have it that his taste is a match for your own. Come, let us go." So you see how he tells his story in terms of it being in the present, even though it is from that half-century before. And you get a sense of a very distinctive voice here, telling us how he ensnared this man, how he really entrapped him, got him to come with him into the catacombs, which is where they go essentially with Montrezor deciding that he's going to seal him up in there and bury him alive. But it's all very friendly at first. It's all very, in fact, he says he shakes his hand and is so delighted to see him, as if you think, this guy's going to murder him. Why is he so pleased? He's so pleased because he's getting his revenge. But outwardly, of course, is the appearance of being warm, friendly, wanting his advice, but, well, I'll go to Lucchese instead, maybe he knows, and just ensnaring him with that sense that Lucchese is a better wine taster than you might be, Fortunato. As is elemental in fiction, Montrezor, the voice of the story, is our protagonist, main character. Fortunato, his antagonist, the man he wants to murder. And murder, as he says, with impunity. That's the source of all the action in the story. This is what many consider a perfect short story, and Poe's best, a psychological journey into the mind of a murderer. Original, carefully crafted, with readers experiencing the horror as the murderer entraps his prey and literally seals him up in a niche tier by tier with stones and mortar. Montrezor may indeed be mad, but he's credible. And from the outset, we're swept up into a story of shock and horror that is relentless. The ultimate terrifying campfire story. It appeared, by the way, a year after Poe's famous poem, The Raven, and just after the last of his 3 detective stories. Poe is seminal, as I said. He's a poet, as well as an editor, a novelist, as well as a short story writer, an essayist. Let's talk about his background a little. He was actually expelled from West Point, and he lived a life afflicted by poverty, poor health, depression, and addiction. His wife, Virginia Clem, who was also his 13-year-old first cousin, died young. And though his stories sold well all over the world, and he published some 70 tales, his literary income as a short story writer never exceeded hundreds of dollars. Let's look at what makes Poe's horror story great by starting with the fact that the story is a perfect example of what Poe's aesthetic theory of a single sitting was based on. That is, the belief in the overall effect of reading a work in one sitting. Poe also believed that truth is the aim of the tale, and he was doubtlessly influenced by the classic thinking we see in the Poetics by Aristotle, the notion that great literary art, specifically tragedy, creates a cathartic or purging effect of pity and terror, and reveals the hubris or pride of characters. The Cask of Amontillado reflects the Aristotelian notion of catharsis, of pity and fear, and the 2 main characters in different ways are suffused with hubris or pride, one in his wine connoisseurship, the other in what he relates as his perfect murder. The essential conflict of revenge is sustained from the story's beginning to its conclusion and manages to move through time in accordance with another Aristotelian precept, the unity of time. The fact that all of the action in the story takes place within a set unity of time, even though it's told from the perspective of a half-century later. The plot is driven by a single incident with a startling and decisive conclusion that involves a man being buried alive in a story propelled by character, Montrezor's character. Montrezor, the murderer, creates ambiguities for his readers, whom he appears to be directly confiding in after 50 years from the murderous act. Passage I just read where he says, "You who know my soul so well." Who's he addressing that to, if not us as readers? Why is he telling this story now? And to whom? To us? Maybe to someone else? What are his real motives? And just how reliable is his version of what occurred in the nitro-filled underground where he lures with the wonderful Sherry Amontillado a man who thinks he is a friend? Well, Montrezor may be unreliable, possibly insane, morally deficient, or evil. He tells a story with clearly mixed emotions that he quite possibly doesn't understand himself. The setting and the atmosphere of the story in Europe during the madness and festive masquerade-filled carnival season, above ground, shifts with dramatic intensity as we move into the underground world of the catacombs. This is part of the psychological nature of the tale and its architecture of the mind, as if we're entering the unconscious or taking the lid off id, moving to a realm below the surface of our outward actions to strong, universal themes that embrace our unconscious motives. There was a woman named Princess Maria Bonaparte who was a patient of Freud's and a psychoanalytic critic, and she said in her analysis of the Cask of Amontillado that we see all these wine bottles and these are obviously phallic symbols. Well, Freud also was at one point given to reminding us that sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. But this story does get us into deep psychological levels, psychoanalytical levels, if you will. And the relationship of the tale to the reader is complex and really quite artful. Montrezor even seems to be directly addressing us, as I said, and we can all be cast a bit like Fortunato, dressed up as fools in a similar role, because you, the reader of the story, like Fortunato, are being left to try to guess what plot is unfolding. You're experiencing a mounting irrational fear and emotion and disbelief with the rising action of the story, and you're ensnared into the story. I want to talk about the origins of this story. It goes back to Poe supposedly hearing an anecdote while serving in the army in 1827 about a lieutenant who was killed in a duel by a young bully of a captain. The lieutenant, while intoxicated, was allegedly sealed up alive. Poe, we should also remember, was poor, very sick, and the story resonates with class difference and class envy. Montrezor seems to have fallen. He says of Fortunato that "You are happy as I once was, rich, respected, admired, beloved, as I once was." Fortunato, as in the word fortune, is noble, and Lucchese, the other wine connoisseur who's mentioned in the story, has a name which suggests lucre or money. Poe had neither fortune nor money. And his stepfather, John Allen, who adopted Poe after Poe's father died when Poe was only 3, was, like Fortunato, a Mason, as well as a man who considered himself a wine connoisseur. Fortunato exclaims to Montrezor, not without contempt, "You, impossible, a Mason?" And Montrezor becomes a different kind of Mason as he uses a trowel to build tears that will suffocate Fortunato. Perhaps psychobiographers who look for meaning in the life of the author might argue Poe was wreaking a kind of vengeance on his stepfather, as well as for the impoverished and unhappy life he lived. The great Argentinian fiction writer Jorge Luis Borges pithily once said of Poe, "He lived a short and unhappy life, if unhappiness can be short." The story was published in 1846 in Godey's Lady's Book, a popular mid-19th century venue for short fiction, which also published Hawthorne, and reflects the popular interest in stories that carry sensation and horror, and stories of revenge. This popular interest in stories that convey both horror and sensation continues to the present day, and interestingly enough was reflected in an episode of the television series Homicide, based on the Cask of Amontillado, in which, as a kind of tribute to Poe and the show's setting in Baltimore, where Poe once lived, a character seals another character up alive. Poe continues to the present day to have many imitators and admirers in both the literary and the popular cultures. I want to do some analysis now of the Cask of Amontillado. D.H. Lawrence saw it as a tale of hatred and murderousness, but envy is a strong motif, and we never know what any of the 1,000 injuries Montrezor has suffered are, or the insult that precipitated his lust for revenge. An insult to family honor appears to be tied in, and the reader is immersed into a world of coats of arms and family mottos, traditions that carry on for centuries as the dead linger in their repose. Punishing with impunity is the course set upon by Montrezor to bring his revenge to fruition. And the story engages us in questions of justice, both here on earth and the theological variety. Fortunato exclaims and Montrezor repeats, "For the love of God." This story, we should always remember, is built on irony. Montrezor, for example, early on gives explicit orders, he tells us, to his attendants not to leave the house, knowing that that will ensure that they will. Psychologically astute of him, to be sure. Fortunato says early on to Montrezor that his cough, that is, Fortunato's cough, will not kill him. "My cough won't kill me," he says, and Montrezor replies, "True, true." Montrezor offers a toast to Fortunato's long life. And the supreme irony may be in the lack of understanding on Montrezor's part of the effect of the murder on his own conscience, from his smiling at the thought of Fortunato's immolation to his admission later on in the story that his heart grows sick, and he blames it on the dampness of the catacombs. That's where we get into even a deeper psychology. If his heart is growing sick and he says it must be because of the dampness of the catacombs, are we to believe him? Or is he perhaps unreliable? Is his conscience or his unconscious playing a role in perhaps precipitating some guilt? There are weaknesses in this story, despite its singular effect and the building up to its climactic impact. It's histrionic. It has what can be described as, I suppose, a puerile style. Henry James called it primitive, and T.S. Eliot called Poe gifted but before puberty. The characters are not flat, but they are somewhat psychologically abstract, and there's a sense of gimmickry or manipulation that Poe uses that some deem non-literary. Montrezor, after all, does pull us in through Poe's ventriloquist manipulation of him manipulating us as readers, and it can seem a bit heavy-handed on Poe's part. But that, we realize, is just what a good or great story, especially a suspense story, is supposed to do. You could almost say it's a suspense or horror storyteller's mandate. The story remains a masterpiece because of its totality and its seminal role in masterful storytelling. What may appear somewhat crude in Poe becomes more stylized and highly developed as the genre of short fiction develops. Julio Cortázar, a short story writer who wrote a book on the beginnings of the modern short story, viewed The Cask of Amontillado as a perfect story and wrote about its successful, insistent race against the clock. Poe sets us up for precisely what Cortázar describes. I took from their sconces 2 flambeaux, and giving one to Fortunato, bowed him through several suites of rooms to the archway that led into the vaults. I passed down a long and winding staircase, requesting him to be cautious as he followed. We came at length to the foot of the descent and stood together on the damp ground of the catacombs of the Montrezors. The gait of my friend was unsteady, and the bells upon his cap jingled as he strode. "The pipe," said he. "It's farther on," said I, "but observe the white webwork which gleams from these cavern walls." He turned toward me and looked into my eyes with two filmy orbs that distilled the rheum of intoxication. "Nitra?" he asked at length. "Nitra," I replied. "How long have you had that cough?" And here we have Fortunato coughing. My poor friend found it impossible to reply for many minutes. "It is nothing," he said at last. "Come," I said with decision, "we will go back. Your health is precious." We know, of course, that he's ensnaring him. He's bringing him in, and it moves us forward, as I said, in a relentless way. He's playing with them. It's like a spider and a fly, saying, "Oh, well, you're coughing. We'll take you back. We'll go back," and so forth. But we know we're moving on, and indeed we do march on. And revenge is, let's face it, a powerful and universal human emotion. It's what pulls us in, even though we don't know why this man is seeking revenge against Fortunato, our narrator. A man is buried alive for reasons that we can't discern, and the very lawlessness of that act, done by someone who has managed to conceal his true lethal motives, is terrifying. It affects us. Plus, there are so many skeletons down there in that subterranean vault. You may remember, in fact, those of you who remember Hamlet, when the gravedigger holds up the skull and says, "Poor Yorick, I knew him well." That's what we call in literature a memento mori. That is, a remembrance to us of our own mortality. When you have a lot of skeletons in a subterranean vault, it's hard not to think of your own mortality. The story's first 3 paragraphs really serve as a perfect setting up or exposition of all that follows in rising and falling action. And the voice in the story is masterfully sustained. It keeps us compelled to stay with the story right up to the end. I want to, in fact, just read an excerpt from the end of the story. "It was now midnight, and my task was drawing to a close. I had completed the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th tier. I had finished a portion of the last and the 11th. There remained but a single stone to be fitted and plastered in. I struggled with its weight. I placed it partially in its destined position. But now there came from out the niche a low laugh that erected the hairs upon my head. It was succeeded by a sad voice, which I had difficulty in recognizing as that of the noble Fortunato. The voice said, 'Ha, ha, ha, he, he, a very good joke indeed, an excellent jest. We will have many a rich laugh about it at the palazzo, he, he, over our wine, he, he. The Amontillado,' I said. He, he. Yes, the Amontillado. But is it not getting late? Will not they be awaiting us at the palazzo, the Lady Fortunato and the rest? Let us be gone." "Yes," I said, "let us be gone." "For the love of God, Montrezor!" "Yes," I said, "for the love of God!" But to these words I hearkened in vain for a reply. I grew impatient. I called aloud, "Fortunato!" No answer. I called again, "Fortunato!" No answer still. I thrust a torch through the remaining aperture and let it fall within. There came forth in return only a jingling of the bells. My heart grew sick on account of the dampness of the catacombs. I hastened to make an end of my labor. I forced the last stone into its position. I plastered it up. Against the new masonry I re-erected the old rampart of bones. For the half of a century no mortal has disturbed them. In pace requiescat. Well, I had a mentor and professor named Walter Tevis, who gained some fame by writing a novel called The Hustler, all about pool shooting, and made into a movie, a famous movie. Also was the author of The Color of Money and The Man Who Fell to the Earth. And he used to say, Edgar Allan Poe, the father of American junk, all that tintintabulation that you hear in some of his poetry. But it really has little to do with Poe as a short story writer. Even the American novelist and short story writer E.L. Doctorow, whose father named him Edgar after Poe, and who also said that Poe was one of our junkie writers, was really talking more about Poe the poet, Once Upon a Midnight Dreary, and all that scary stuff, creepy stuff about dead young women by the sea. Beautiful young woman to Poe was the most aesthetically moving thing of all, and as I said, he was married to this 13-year-old cousin who died young. But Poe was a master storyteller, and it should make you want to read more Poe, both poetry and short fiction, because his poetry is well worth reading too, even if you think it's junky. Read more fiction like The Telltale Heart if you haven't, or The Fall of the House of Usher. You also might want to read Washington Irving to see how Poe avoided the meandering quality in Irving's tales, which helped establish him as by many accounts the seminal figure in the modern short story. Poe's heirs are popular writers like H.P. Lovecraft and Stephen King and Shirley Jackson, whom we'll be talking about, masters of the horror story. And next for us, two other great horror storytellers who shift the boundaries of the natural world, into encounters with the world of the supernatural. We see in the next pair of authors we're going to study, Nathaniel Hawthorne and Nikolai Gogol, more didacticism than we see in Poe. Remember that Horace, one of the earliest literary critics of ancient Rome, said that the purpose of literature is to teach as well as to please or entertain. With Poe, it's mostly about the pleasing or the entertaining. Horror can be entertaining, as we see in all too many scary movies and TV shows. Writers like Hawthorne and Gogol entertain us, they scare us with horror, but they also stretch realism and credibility and become more moralizing than Poe. You might ask the question, why is early fiction so fixated on horror? Well, because magazines were where horror stories appeared. Magazines were where stories appeared, and horror was what magazine writers craved, what magazine readers craved. Could a writer make readers quake in fear with the notion that one could actually murder with impunity, escape moral or eternal judgment as secularism and loss of faith continue to rise? Well, the Cask of Amontillado is a realistic, true-to-life story, a well-made tale driven by plot and a realism, or what we call verisimilitude, being true to life, that will dominate the 19th century, even though with Hawthorne and Gogol we see stories that veer off into the supernatural. The Cask of Amontillado is Gothic, gloomy, grotesque, and violent, an arabesque, intricate in its design, but it cleaves to standards of realism, as do the other masters of the well-made tale of the 19th century, like Guy de Maupassant, Anton Chekhov, and Henry James, who wrote a famous supernatural, haunting ghost story called The Turn of the Screw. Despite the ventures into the supernatural in Hawthorne and Gogol and a seminal writer like Washington Irving, we remain largely tethered in 19th century storytelling to a strong sense of realism and credibility. Stories, as we shall see, become more complicated in craft and technique and in character. Great stories are connected to other great stories and build on their predecessors in a tapestry of intertextuality. Poe and Hawthorne admired and wrote about each other's work, and our next lecture will be on Hawthorne, another of the great 19th century American storytellers, and author of a tale that is generally regarded as his most compelling. The sense of fiendishness, the frightful, the horrific, and the demonic, as you'll see, resonates in this other American master as well. But we owe a lion's share of credit to Poe for masterfully bringing us into the world we recognize as that of the genre of the short story, and of providing much of, well, forgive the apt metaphor, the mortar and masonry that created for us a whole new way of envisioning fiction.